Hi, everyone. This is Tom Parmalee, the founder of funeralvision.com, and joining me today is Danielle Burmeister, the Vice President of Marketing Communications at Homesteaders Life Company. Danielle is also one of our speakers at Mastermind, Elevating Your Funeral Service Business to New Heights, which will be Thursday, September 11th at the Live Casino and Hotel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You can learn more about the event at mastermindfuneral.com or by clicking on the events tab on funeralvision.com. Thanks so much for joining me today, Danielle.
Thanks for having me.
Danielle, you grew up in funeral service. So why don't you share a little bit about your story? I'm not sure if you always knew that would one day enter the profession or if you toyed with the idea of doing something else. So why don't you just share a little bit about your story?
Oh, I'd be happy to. So I grew up in the profession. My dad is a licensed funeral director in Iowa. We he was always worked in funeral homes my entire childhood, but when I was in first grade, we moved to a new town and we actually moved into an apartment above the funeral home. That was the first time I was really in the funeral space full time. But my dad was the only licensed director on staff, and my mom actually started working as his office manager. And so we kind of grew up as if it was a family business. It wasn't owned by my dad; it was owned by a farmers co-op. But we grew up kind of doing all of the work in the funeral home. You know, my first job was washing cars in the funeral home, delivering notice cards. We were in a small town, so we still delivered like notice cards to all the local businesses when there was a death because the paper didn't publish more than once a week. So back in the day when you had the traditional 3 day model, if you didn't get the obit out, somehow people would miss it and then they would get very upset. So I grew up in and around the business, and I absolutely did not want to be in funeral service to my dad's chagrin. I didn't want to have the hours that he had to keep and just the toll that it takes on your mental and physical health. I watched that with both of my parents, and I knew that that was not kind of what I wanted for myself. But I did eventually kind of find my way back into the funeral profession. I taught for a while at a college and then moved into marketing full time. And an opportunity came up at Homesteaders about 10 years ago. And my dad, he knew I was looking. He's like, you need to apply. This is an incredible company doing great work. It would be a great fit for you. So I did. And that was, a decade ago. And that's kind of my entry back into funeral service. And now I can't imagine working in any other profession. It's so rewarding. And the work that we do together is so important. And it makes my dad so proud.
Now you've worked at Homesteaders for more than 10 years. It's hard for me to believe because I remember starting to work with you, I think when you first joined the company. It's been
Mhm.
great to get to know you over the years. But that's a long time. So you must really love the company. You must love the culture. What makes Homesteaders such a great place to work?
I think one of the things I love most about homesteaders is how embedded it is in the funeral space. You know, as much as I didn't want to be in the day-to-day operations of a funeral home, I really love the work that funeral providers do, and it gives me an opportunity to kind of be in that space in a way that works well with my skill set, and I feel like I'm doing good work in a way that feels good. I believe really strongly that we have incredible leadership and strategic direction. Steve Schaefer, I would work for Steve at any company. He is just an incredibly strategic thinker. He's got great long-term vision, and he just deeply cares about the success of the profession, the success of our company, making sure that we are keeping the policy owner first and foremost in our mind. We're very purpose driven at Homesteaders, and so that makes it feel more like you're kind of mission focused than you get at a lot of insurance companies. You know, I'm in Des Moines, Iowa, which is kind of the insurance capital of the Midwest, and there's a lot of insurance carriers that I could work for, but this is really the only one that I would want to be at. And we have a lot of incredibly talented and passionate people. I have an amazing team that I get to work with every single day, and they make it really easy to do good work.
Now, for myself, being in marketing and communications like you, I just love seeing everything you put out as a company, whether it's your annual letter, some kind of newsletter. And along those lines, one of the really cool things you started doing, I think last year, was you started a podcast called Calling Hours, which you
Mhm.
host. So tell me a little bit about that. What's it been like growing that? Launching it, seeing it grow, and maybe share with us, an episode or two that really sticks out as one of your favorite ones.
And that's like picking a favorite child. Though honestly, my favorite child is my oldest because he's the one that's potty trained right now. But yeah, we started calling ours about a year ago, and the vision for it, kind of the conceptual feel of it, was that we wanted people as they're listening to it to feel like they're sitting at a coffee shop, and they're drinking their coffee, and there's a conversation happening at the table next to them, and it's so interesting and fascinating that even after their coffee is empty, they stay because they're so interested in what's going on next to them. And so that's the feel we want people to have as they're listening to it, that you get to listen in on really interesting conversations with so many fascinating guests. So it's been really a fun kind of project for me to get to work on because I get to have conversations with a lot of really interesting people in the space. And it gives them a platform to talk about why they are in the funeral profession, what their experience has been, what keeps them motivated to serve families. And we've been able to really grow our following. We even like 6 episodes in, we were within the top half of all podcasts on Apple Podcasts, which is just really incredible. I think the death care space, you're starting to see a lot more people engaging in podcasts as a medium, but there's still, I think, room for a lot of people in this space to provide really good, solid content. So, I mean, I am still partial to our very first episode. That was the one that I hosted with Steve Schaefer. But I also have really enjoyed talking to some of kind of the industry legends, those who have really been in the space for a long time. So I interviewed Barbara Chemis, the executive director of Cana last year. That was just an incredible conversation. She is a library scientist by trade. And so it was really interesting to hear about how she transitioned into the death care space and what that experience has been like, what she's seen and kind of the cremation landscape and how that's impacting providers. And then a really beautiful conversation with John Heald, who's just an industry tycoon. You know, he's just done such great work in so many good companies, and just his work on the foundation. And he's just an amazing human to talk to. So I mean, I love all of the episodes. So I think they're all worth listening to. But those have been some of the ones that I've enjoyed the most.
It's a great podcast. If you're watching out there and you haven't seen it, check it out. And at Mastermind, you're going to be delivering a session titled Competing on Service in a Price-Sensitive Market. I suppose one of my first questions is whether or not there's a particular region that you find that's a little bit more price sensitive than another. And what are you anticipating moving forward? We're in a bit of a strange economy right now with lots of talk about tariffs and a very volatile stock market. So I'm wondering if you're anticipating that price sensitivity perhaps going up a bit in the next several months.
Yeah, I think anytime you see the level of market volatility that we're experiencing right now, you're going to worry about consumers being more price conscious. You know, they only have 100 pennies in a dollar, and if twice as many of those are going to their basic household staples, there's just not extra pennies left. But I think I'm less concerned about that in the funeral space because I think consumers that want to and value ceremony and tradition and want to have a full service funeral are still going to find ways to make that work. What I think we'll probably see is more consumers looking at pre-planning with multi-pay plans where they're paying month to month over time instead of a lump sum. But I think that it's just like any market volatility. There's going to be ups and downs, and consumer preferences are going to shift and change. But on the long run, when you look at growing populations and mortality rates and things like that, I think the long-term view of funeral service is still very, very positive. In terms of price sensitivity in certain markets, I don't know that there's particular regions that you can point to, like the Southeast being more price conscious than the Northwest. But I think that you do see within those regions pockets of people that are more price conscious than others. It's going to come down to more individual markets, which is why like a market analysis is really important because it's going to tell consumer funeral homes which consumers are in their markets and how they need a message. But I think you do see some commonality in the factors that can lead to more price consciousness. So lots of competition is always going to increase the comparison points in the minds of consumers. Especially if one of those competitors is a low cost provider, a value brand that is doing a lot of messaging and marketing in the space around prices. If you have a lot of full service providers and the model is still traditionally that 3-day service with the visitation and the luncheon and things like that, having increased levels of competition isn't necessarily going to correlate to increased price consciousness because they're not competing on prices, they're not messaging on prices, they're competing on different kinds of service. There's always going to be economic factors. There are pockets of the United States that there's just not resources for large funerals, and so families have to make tough decisions, and those tough decisions generally mean that they're going to be more price conscious. But in the flip side of that, even in those pockets, you still have large pockets of religious clusters that even though they might not have the economics to make a big funeral work, it's still very important to them in their religious tradition. So it's really hard to say, there's big areas of the United States that are more price conscious than others because it just depends so much on that market, the unique market that a funeral home is selling.
Those are some great insights. I know where I live, you can drive maybe 30 minutes away and you might be in a much more affluent area or the reverse. So I can definitely see what you're saying there. Um, at Mastermind, which again is September 11th in Philadelphia, I imagine you're going to be digging into some of these issues that you outlined a little bit more. What are, some of the takeaways that you hope people will walk away with after your presentation, whether it might be something they can focus on, to sort of break through some of that price sensitivity or what have you? What are some, maybe bullet points, if you will, that you hope to focus on?
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of what we talk about is competing on service. That's that service and hospitality. That is going to be one of the best ways that funeral providers who are in the service and hospitality space can differentiate themselves from low cost competitors. And with that, hand in hand goes the emphasis on personalization. The more that funeral providers can become good stewards of personal histories and personal stories, and then kind of transfer that information into really beautiful experiential services that are incredibly personal and reflect the individual that they are honoring, the better they're going to be positioned to combat conversations around price. I would also point to being able to win in the aftercare space. So the firms that do the best and that have the fewest conversations about price are the ones that are providing exceptional service after the funeral concludes. So I encourage funeral homes to look at what they're doing in terms of grief support, aftercare resources, not just in those first few weeks, but in the full year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. How are you serving those families? Because that leaves a lasting impression. The funeral homes that remember the deceased date of death or date of birth or wedding anniversary when no one else remembers, that sticks in someone's mind. And that's going to make them much more likely to choose that firm over and over again. And then the other piece I would say is you have to own the digital space, especially when it comes to online reviews. More and more consumers are making decisions about big purchases, not by asking their friends and family, but by going to Google because it's faster, it's more convenient, they get a wide range. And so I encourage funeral homes when I'm giving this presentation to really look at their online review presence. And if they're not winning in that space, to find vendors or find a strategy that works for them to start to generate those online reviews so they can capture that traffic.
It sounds like it's going to be an awesome presentation, Danielle. I can't wait to see the full 60 minutes. I always like concluding with this last question because I just learned so much and have gotten so many great book recommendations and website recommendations. Um, is there a resource or a book or something that you've stumbled across recently that you want to point out to those watching out there? It can be anything, and it doesn't necessarily have to relate to pre-need per se, but what have you stumbled across that you think is useful?
I love this question. This is actually one of the questions we end the Calling Hours podcast with. Every guest we ask what they're reading right now. I just finished this really interesting book called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. Have you heard of this?
I have not, but it sounds
So
interesting.
it was recommended to me by my sister, and it's about looking at time management in terms of your mortality. So the average life expectancy of a human adult is 4,000 weeks. And when you look at it in terms of that and how short that time period is, he makes the point in a really interesting way with a lot of data and a lot of different perspectives about time management that the way that you view the choices you're making about how you spend your time is different when you realize how limited it is. So I really enjoyed the book. It made me think differently about the choices I was making around my time. But I think in this space in particular, because we are so often confronted with mortality, I think it's one that funeral providers would really enjoy as well.
I'm going to definitely have to pick that one up. I think it's going to definitely make me want to stop scrolling on social media
It really
because
does.
we all fall
Yeah.
into that trap sometime, I think.
Yeah. Well, and if you're an audiobook listener, Oliver Berkman has a really lovely British accent and he reads the book. So it's a nice, easy read too.
Well, Danielle, I want to thank you so much for being a speaker at Mastermind, elevating your funeral service business to new heights, which will be September 11th in Philadelphia. And of course, I also want to thank Homesteaders for being a platinum sponsor of the event. If you haven't checked out Mastermind yet, visit mastermindfuneral.com or you can click on the events tab on funeralvision.com. And if you register before June 19th, you'll get our early bird rate, and it's approved for CEUs by the Academy as well as numerous other states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and others. And we've also applied to New Jersey, of course. Thanks again so much for joining me, Danielle, and can't wait to see your presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. It's always lovely to catch up with you.